Good afternoon, everyone. Seems though we have a lot of folks on the phone today, so when we eventually get to intros, we'll certainly do that. For those on the phone, they're missing a beautiful Washington weather day. We have some folks who are here from the West Coast. We did our best to give a great December day here in Washington. It's beautiful here. So good afternoon, everyone. What I'd like to do is remind everyone that we have a full quorum and lots of folks on the phone. And as we go around presenting as well as asking questions, that we do our best to speak clearly into the microphone so everybody who's on the audio bridge can hear us very well. If I could ask everyone to silence their cell phones and be in a place where we can conduct our business. So now I'm going to turn the microphone over to our designated federal officer to officially call the meeting to order. Jeff.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everybody, to the nation's capital here, the holiday season. It's kind of nicer looking outside. Not only is the weather nicer, but there are things to look at besides the buildings. And so maybe you'll have some time to do that while you're here if you came from out of town or even if you didn't. Today, we're going to be hearing from all 7, or all 8 rather, of our working groups, and in some cases we have subgroups. We'll hear from those as well. There'll be status reports. We're not going to have votes today. We will have votes in March, and in every council meeting after March there will be votes. So I just want to remind everybody of that. And so that's the sort of the run of show today. I won't go into detail on any of the reports. You're going to be hearing about that later, but I just wanted to thank you for coming and enjoy the day.
Well, thank you all as well. And I might add, in addition to being a truly beautiful December day in our nation's capital, we're also very fortunate to be in a city with the first place football team. Enjoy it, because it may not last long. But we're excited about that here in D.C. And I had to, after watching Navy football lose to Houston, I needed to look for one ray of sunshine in the weekend's football. So anyway, welcome to the third meeting of CSRIC under its 5th charter. And we're grateful for your time and service and appreciate your knowledge and expertise that you've each brought to the tasks ahead of you. Today, you'll be hearing from the working group chairs regarding their group's progress thus far. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about your interim results and also should there be any need for refinements, hearing what those might be and having the group collective contribute to what those refinements might be. The missions and milestones are important and aggressive, and we recognize that the tasks are complex and want to make sure that we have a regular iterative back and forth to make sure that those complex tasks aren't keeping us from getting to the important goals with that aggressive schedule. We also have one group which has now received its co-chairs, and Working Group 8 will also restate their tasking for the first time, what the other groups did in the last session. So we look forward to hearing from the Priority Services Working Group today also. And before the presentations begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank each of the chairs. The chairs have given up a significant amount of their time from their day jobs, and we had a chance to have lunch with most of the chairs, and I'd like to reiterate my thanks for your hard work and leadership. We particularly appreciate the due diligence that you've been applying to ensure that your group is working towards recommendations in a careful and deliberate manner. You have our gratitude for your willingness to engage. This is an important public-private partnership. It's a great example, I think, of where that works best, and it serves not only our mission, but serves the nation's mission in helping to ensure security, reliability, and interoperability of communication systems and infrastructure for the nation. So thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Simpson. Also with my welcome. I wanted to take a moment and just reflect on some of the recent events and point out the importance of the work that we're doing here in CSRIC 5 initiatives. The recent attacks in Paris and now, tragically San Bernardino, California, highlight the need for our emergency alert systems and platforms to protect the public, as well as coordination across all the different groups of first responders. So it really, unfortunately and tragically, puts an exclamation point on a lot of the work here of CSRIC 5. In addition, we've become aware of a need to secure the communication systems and the resiliency in our undersea cable system. There's been an awful lot of press about that lately, and where much of our international data and information is transmitted across transoceanic cable systems. Lastly, we see the need for significantly increased cyber skills and a workforce of talented folks to meet the demands. Recently, some estimates that I read said that there are over 1 million unfulfilled security jobs worldwide, and more than 80% of companies lack all the sufficient resources to fulfill their security needs. So this working group is not a customary one in CSRIC 5, but also a real important one. Like Admiral Simpson, I do want to thank our new co-chairs in Working Group 8, who we did not have in place at our last meeting. So, thank you very much, Bill and Tom from New Star and Cisco, respectively. And then much in the same spirit as previous meetings, I'd like to ask that we go around and do some introductions, and I'll go to the phone after we go around the room here with our council members as well as our FCC liaisons. If you could just briefly introduce yourself and the company and the organization you represent. I'll start to my left and go around clockwise.
Hello, I'm Bill Bonney from T-Mobile.
Robert Mayer, U.S. Telecom.
Brian Joseph, CTIA.
Francisco Sanchez, Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management.
Farouk Katibi, Qualcomm.
Susan Miller, Addis.
Joel Molinoff, CBS.
Cheryl Greathouse, APCO.
Kyle Malady, Verizon.
Andy Ellis, Akamai, and Admiral, if you're enjoying being in a city with the first place team and get addicted to that, you're always welcome in Boston.
Whoa.
There's a response. Anybody from Denver here? That young quarterback looked pretty good, didn't
he? He did, especially when they don't throw flags.
There you go. I'm with you. Really, my son's a New England fan, so that's always my number 2.
All right, back to CSRIC 5.
Allison Peacock, AT&T.
Tim Lorello, standing in for Maurice Tozay from Telecommunications Systems, or TCS.
Kent Bressie, Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis for the North American Submarine Cable Association.
Trey Fogarty with the National Emergency Number Association.
Jennifer Manner with EchoStar.
Gary Smith, Cherry Creek Radio.
Kelly Williams, standing in for Sam Matheny from the National Association of Broadcasters.
Bob Gessner, representing the American Cable Association.
Bill Check, NCTA.
Inet Fury, DHS.
Scott Weber with Charter Communications.
Tony Cole with FireEye.
Teresa Hennessy, Comcast. Suzanne Cameron with the FCC.
Jeff Goldthorpe, FCC.
And our two, Bilbid. You have two? Our Working Group 8 chairs. Oh, they're going to present.
Yeah, they're going to present. So if we could have council members on the phone introduce themselves briefly, and we know we have a bunch who are on the phone today.
Richard Perlato from the Shadow Server Foundation.
Hi, it's Dana Golub from PBS.
Jonathan from the CNI.
Greg Donaldson in Toronto.
Joe Meyer, Sprint. Tim Walden, CenturyLink.
Rob Wasseredi, TIA.
Good afternoon, Dorothy Spears-Dean representing NASNet.
Rod Rasmussen with IID. Steve Johnson representing NCTA.
Mark Hannes representing Riverside Office of Emergency Management in Riverside, UASI.
Jeff England, Silverstar Communications, and I'd like to add it's 19 degrees and snowing here in the mountains of Wyoming.
Top of the ski lift, sure.
Todd Summers, Phoenix Fire Department, 72 degrees.
Mark Hazy, Commerce, NOAA.
Hi, this is Rao Vasiredi, TIA.
Jim Leno from Salcom in Green Bay, Wisconsin, Packer City, USA.
Kim Keever, Cox Communications.
Lori Flaherty with the National 911 Program.
Danny McPherson, VeriSign. PayPal in a chilly 60-degree La Quinta, California.
Okay, that sounds like everyone. So we'll begin our working group presentations. We'll start with working group 1 and advance numerically through all of our working groups with subgroups. We'll have 9 presentations today, as Jeff said. For each presentation, we'll allot about 20 minutes to update the council on the work in the working groups. I'll administer questions, as I have in the past, from the council members here and on the phone after the presentations. We'll continue to use our time-honored method of place cards. If someone has a question, I'll look around the room for your tent card on its side to call upon you for a question, then we'll get to the questions on the phone right after that. So we're going to start with Working Group 1, Evolving Our 911 Systems, and I think we have Jeff and Susan who are presenting. Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Jeff Cohen with APCO International, and happy to provide a report on Working Group 1 on behalf of my co-chair, Susan Sherwood, on Evolving 911 Services. So we'll step through the deliverables, and I'll start off by saying that yesterday the working group had a very productive call. So there's some changes that I'll talk about that didn't get reflected in the slides because we submitted them so timely. And I'll point those out. They're minor, but I'll point them out. So our first task, which the deliverable is due next March, when it should be a little bit warmer here, we're to review public safety and industry best practices and standard operating procedures on legacy, transitional, meaning IP-based, and next-generation 911 systems for rerouting 911 calls between PSAPs due to the use of cell sectors for routing purposes, and where necessary, identify gaps and make recommendations towards optimizing PSAP reroutes. And again, the deliverable for that is March of 2016. In this regard, we've identified 4 key topics that we will need to review and include in our report on Task 1. The first, which is already underway, as I'll get to in a minute, public safety and industry best practices and standard operating procedures on legacy, transitional, and next-gen systems. Second is to analyze interjurisdictional coordination on MSAG, or Master Street Address Guide, and GIS, Geographical Information Systems, to cover areas where cell sector coverage may lead to routing to an incorrect jurisdiction. Also, we're going to be looking at wireless voice 911 call routing decision process, and while we're still discussing this as a working group in terms of exactly what we're going to study, at least as of yesterday in our call, this is about the initial setup, when cell sites are initially set up and the routing decisions to be made, or during maintenance of cell systems and the changes that may have to flow from that. but that's fluid. Also, the last, I guess, sub-bullet on this slide, just yesterday we decided to move to Task 2. This has to do with SMS or MMS, Interim Text to 911 call routing and decision process. The reason why we're moving it to Task 2 is, I'll get to on the very next slide, is because we, after discussing this a little bit more yesterday, we thought it would fit better with location-based routing. And speaking of which, that gets me to our Task 2. First, a little typo. We say work expected to start late February 2014. I would describe us as anxious and ready, but it really is 2016. So with Task 2, as I alluded to just before, this is about studying and making recommendations on the architectural, technical, operational standards, and cybersecurity requirements of location-based routing that uses longitude and latitude, usually it's the other way around, information or other location identification methods when available to determine and route a 911 call to the nearest appropriate PSAP. We will also be exploring and reporting on the pros and cons of various sources of location information that are available for location-based routing, the potential reliability and accuracy of these sources, and the transition path to location-based routing from legacy to transitional and then fully deployed NG911 systems. You might see that there's some commonality where we are talking in kind of three stages: legacy, transitional, and next gen. And in particular, identifying the necessary roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders involved in supporting 911 calls and identifying existing and future standards to support the transition. A deliverable for this Task 2 will be in September of next year. The next couple of slides are our working group members. I'll just run through the two slides. I would say, and I was talking with Susan earlier, that I think we have a great group. The discussions we've been having thus far have been very productive and very helpful. So everyone's been a terrific contributor, and I think we have a great balance on the working group. So in terms of status, we've been holding biweekly meetings, including, as I mentioned, just yesterday. We're going to switch to weekly meetings shortly, just after the holidays, because of our upcoming March deliverable. We have so far developed a project plan to complete the Task 1 report. The working group members, if you remember, I identified that we were going to be looking at best practices, standard operating procedures, et cetera. And we have already identified many sources of call routing and call handling standards and best practices. We already have a good list, and we're still exploring and collecting those. We've started to compile these on a review template that actually Susan had created to ease our review. And we've also started to review the template of the report itself to start customizing it to the Task 1 deliverables. Next slide is about our status and potential obstacles to task completion. The first is just about the ability to devote the sufficient time and to complete our work. But we do have a work plan, as I mentioned, and for now, it certainly seems while we will be pretty busy, we're definitely aiming towards completing everything we're looking to accomplish. And then this second bullet is kind of moot now as a result of our meeting yesterday. We thought maybe that this would be a barrier, exploring the SMS and MMS routing and decision-making progress, but since we find it more appropriate to move it into Task 2, that no longer will be an identified potential obstacle. And in terms of our schedule, as I mentioned, we're going to move to weekly calls soon after the holidays. We will submit our Task 1 report to the CSRIC board by February 15th, submit the final based on whatever feedback we get by March 4th, and start working on our Task 2 by the end of February. And then finally submitting that Task 2 report by September 14th. And with that, that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm looking around the room for questions for Jeff. I don't see any.
Hey, Jeff, yesterday in the grim tragedy out in San Bernardino, there was one positive highlight from our perspective with regard to where technology, the kind of routing information that today is possible, has pulled together for a while. We've been working together with DHS and with Cal OES, Karen Wong, out there with their vendors and the carriers in California on a dashboard that puts a dot every time there's a 911 call made in California. They average about 60 calls a minute. I think I have that right. 60 calls a minute in California. And the incident in San Bernardino had, before any calls or any notification of the state had been made, a bloom that popped up that was anomalous right around where the incident was, that gave a very good feel for the scale of where the issue was before there was even a report that there was a shooter. And just eye-opening with regard to the kind of positive situational awareness that can be gained in emergencies and disasters from a better sharing of information with regard to 911 and 911 calls. So I think that while your work isn't directly related to that situational awareness piece, it's tangentially associated with it, because the better we are in that first routing decision, the more accurate we are in that, the more accurate then that situational awareness is when that bloom of calls comes around a particular emergency area that will make possible big data kind of value added to emergency response. So would ask that as you guys work on your tasks, that you also think about some of those secondary value propositions associated with getting task 1 and task 2 right.
Yeah, well, thank you, Admiral. That's an exciting development, and I see the relevance to our work, so I'll bring it back.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Before you leave, Jeff, any questions from specifically council members on the phone? Okay, with that, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for that update. So we're going to move to Working Group 2, which is our emergency alerting platforms. And we've got 2 chairs, but I'm not sure if Farouk is, or Francisco. It's Farouk. It's going to present.
Thank you. I'm Farouk Katibi with Qualcomm, and I'm co-lead of Working Group 2, and I will present part of it, and then Robert Sanchez would finish it if it's okay. So, let's see, very good. So the scope of Working Group 2 is twofold. One is on the security aspects of the wireless emergency alert via. We want to make sure that the service is secured end to end. Also, we are looking at ways to encourage local and state use of the alert system, especially with respect to having people providing information. I think Admiral Simpson pointed out how, like, what happened yesterday, potentially that information could be used for public safety. So related to that, that's a very timely information that we are also investigating into that. So we have 2 deliverables. The security aspects is due March of next year, very short timeline, and we are working feverishly to accomplish that. On the recommendation on the one-to-many and many-to-one, we have a little bit more time, and that's due September of 2016. We have a large group of volunteer members. We really appreciate folks who are volunteering and providing input. And my colleague Francisco Sanchez has been very good at recruiting more people to help us understand. So we really appreciate all the volunteers who've been helping us progress the work. So I'm going to provide a short, brief summary of the status and the progress of the security, and Francisco is going to talk about the alert aspect. From the security sub-working group, we have had bi-weekly meetings, calls. As a matter of fact, for working group 2, we have weekly calls, but we alternate between the two. So security 1 week, alert the next week. We have had presentations from PBS One. We have had presentation from Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Group. So we kind of did a survey of what the work that has been done so far. In addition, we actually have started the report, and the report has several sections, and we have asked volunteers, and I'm very grateful for volunteers to agree to draft input to the different parts of the report, and we are receiving contributions, and hopefully we are striving towards that March 2016 deadline. Just a brief overview of what we are doing with respect to security, VIA security sub-working group. We have decomposed the VIA pipeline starting from the alert originators to the IPOS, the integrated public alert and warning system, to the CMSPs, basically the commercial mobile service provider, and all the way to the alert originator. And so we have said, okay, these are the different elements of the VIA, and what are the potential security issues, and how do we mitigate those? So our task has been to construct scenarios. For example, a disgruntled employee may try to sabotage the system. So we come up with some scenarios. Based on those scenarios, we say, okay, what are the potential threats and vulnerabilities? So we start analyzing those, and then we say, okay, if those are the threats, what are the probability of those happening? If they happen, what's the impact, and what's the risk exposure? So once we did that analysis, then we say, okay, based on that, how do we mitigate those risks? How do we ensure those don't happen? And how do we address those? So that's the approach that we are taking. So what are the next steps with respect to security working groups? We are actually doing the full analysis based on the elements of the security, the VIA chain. We incorporate all those findings into the report. We are planning to finalize the report early March, and we will have it during the next CSRIC meeting in March 16. With that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Francisco, please.
Thank you, Farouk. On the alerting side of this particular tasking, for Working Group 2, we have an exciting opportunity to look at, a broad set of issues. Some of those wireless emergency alerts, mass notification systems, many of which incorporate some of the capabilities that we're tasked at exploring. So that'll be interesting for us to take a look at. Social media, which is increasingly more active in not only in alerts and but in notification and warning people, and some of those social media organizations taking a very proactive approach and putting together specific alerting capabilities. So we'll be examining those that are important not only in emergency public information, but we want to take a look at how they are used on the preparedness level, so folks are accustomed to us being in that space. In light of recent events, for example, in Paris, we saw Facebook's checking in safe capability that was able to, people were able to report that they were doing fine, was something that was very widely used. So we're hoping to get a presentation on that. The focus on geo-targeting, which is an issue that we struggle with when it comes to alerting the right people at the right time about things that are happening in their specific area. But again, lots of improvements going on in that. So obviously a topic that we're very interested in. Identifying barriers and solutions. Lots of issues we can look at, but there's also a lot of creative solutions out there, either coming from those originators or people in the techie and digital world that are coming up with those solutions for us. So we'll try to explore that as well. and identifying the kind of best practices that'll help us to improve public safety outcomes and make some recommendations in that regard. Again, broad sets of issues, so that's the opportunity, and we hope to look at those. The challenge is going to be how do we focus and narrow down that so we can come up with some productive and constructive recommendations and a document that will be able to have a good path forward for us. In terms of deliverable goals, one will be to promote the use of emergency alerts by state and local officials at the geo-targeting level. I think just initially on those discussions, part of the issue is the more granular those alerts are, the more they are likely to use those at the geo-targeting level, so we'll be taking a look at that. There are some recommendations that have come out on that, but also some improvements from the technology side. Especially if it's going to be a bell ringer technology, that improved geo-targeting is going to be an important piece. Secondly, looking at leveraging various alerting platforms, whether they are WIA, EAS, social media, or mass notification systems. With all those options out there, which ones are alert originators going to? Are there issues of integration that might make it easier? So instead of entering 16 different alerts into 16 different platforms, is there a way to use integration to make that easier and overcome that barrier? And obviously, looking at technical barriers and some potential solutions, whether that's technical barriers with WIA or any of those other systems, we'll be exploring those. And also the development of standards based on best practices that include some established sociology and improve some of those public safety outcomes. There's a lot of recent work that's being published in terms of social science that tells us how to frame those messages. Lots of additional studies currently on the way, so we'll be taking a look at those to see how we can incorporate that. And then something that's of particular interest, the many-to-one and one-to-many solutions. So it's not just us pushing out a message. How do we capture those information from folks that receive that so we have better situational awareness? Capabilities that exist in many of those systems already, from mass notification systems, social media. So should those capabilities exist elsewhere? If so, where? How should they be deployed? And how can we look forward to stay ahead of the curve? And the Admiral made an interesting point when he talked about the balloons of calls that came in yesterday. Well, 10 years ago in emergency management, we were making high-impact, high-consequence decisions in a short amount of time frame with almost no information. Fast forward to today, and we're still making high-impact, high-consequence decisions in a condensed time frame with tons of information. The challenge and the blind spot's the same: information. We used to not have very much. Now we almost have too much. And so maybe we need to look at how do we identify those anomalies. If something pops up in social media that's an anomaly, that ought to be a trigger that maybe something is happening. If it's a 911 calls, or all of these things are out there, how can we, to improve situational awareness, how maybe do we get notified of that pretty quickly without necessarily knowing the content, but a trigger that tells us something is happening so we can be engaged at a quicker pace. And our study approach, we want to look at the current status of what's happening right now, identify some best practices, not only from practitioners, developers, and researchers, but also want to take a look at it and view it from the consumer perspective and what are those expectations, because there's a constant evolution in what the consumer expects, because we have all this information readily available at our fingertips. There are different expectations, and those continue to grow, and we want to make sure that we look at those. Identify a way forward to have a better understanding and come back with some recommendations. So the team for our working group, traditional stakeholders that are familiar not only with the process, but also bring some subject matter expertise, not only about the issues that we're talking about, but also this process. The private sector, obviously from carriers and vendors. Local, state, and federal government, our key federal partners that are a part of this, are engaged. And we did some special outreach to researchers and academics, those that are actually looking at this. So we've got some folks that are doing that are also on this working group. Social media, Twitter is on board, just on time for this recent call on Monday. Nextdoor, who does very geo-targeted alerting by neighborhoods, is now on board. So the group continues to grow. And also some emergency management, due to some recruitment that was happening. We do have some more local emergency management folks that are now a part of this process that can hopefully contribute to that dialogue. So we did take the opportunity to reach out to people that are already doing this outside of this area. The CDC, for example, is now on board. They were part of another group, so we're bringing those kinds of talents to the table. So the meetings to date, we just wrapped up our third meeting, had an initial meeting on the orientation and what our goals are. We did a review of the current research. Dr. Jeanette Hudson with the University of Kentucky gave us a look at one meeting of some of her research that looked at over 6 billion tweets, 19 specific hazards, and 6 specific events that brought some very interesting things. Well, I like to think I'm very familiar with this topic. We had some interesting and insightful things that came up. The use of capital letters, how we use URLs, how we use hashtags, multimedia, all of those things, some lessons learned that I think would be surprising to folks. So we're learning a lot in that process. And we also had a presentation this week from DeafLink, a group that does some work across the country, and how we communicate with the deaf and hard of hearing and functional and access needs. Some of those lessons can be applied to those mass notification systems, social media. How do we that do a pretty good job of incorporating and integrating various forms of alerts into one platform? So those are the kinds of things that we'll be taking a look at. We did have a brief presentation on the FCC proposed enhancements to WIA. Thought that was important so that people understood the work that had been done up to now, but also because some of these folks were new to this process, hadn't been involved with CSRIC or a working group before. I think they were able to see, this is what happens when we come up with good, solid recommendations. This is how the process moves along to sort of encourage that work and that feedback, and so we thought that was important. So our next steps, continue presentations and education to make sure that we have a better understanding of all these challenges as we move forward, and fine-tune the objectives and expectations. As I mentioned, some of these are very broad categories when you tell us to look at social media, mass notification systems, and all these platforms. And I will tell you, I occasionally get asked to do a social media presentation every couple of months. In the past 3 years, that presentation has never been the same. This is something where that ecosystem changes on a very regular basis. So the more informed we are, the better. Once we do that and fine-tune that to have a very focused look on some of these areas, we'll be assigning some tasks for homework, and our goal is to bring back a draft report in early summer or late spring for us to be able to get to the full CSRIC on schedule, a document by September 2016. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Francisco and Farouk. I'm looking around the room for council members who may have a question.
Francisco, thanks so much, and it's great to have a public safety professional who has such great bona fides in this area and who's also kind of seen the future with your BTOP implementation. So thanks for leading this. I love the fact that you're bringing in the private sector and getting so many ideas on the art of the possible with Twitter and Facebook and all the other options there. It strikes me that one of the challenges that officials like yourself that I talk to around the country from state to state and locality to locality say, yeah, but we don't want to confuse the public with something that's non-authoritative. And so it seems to me that it would be useful as you look at this that we recognize that we'll be in a state of near perpetual change in this area, the next new thing, and we would want to find mechanisms that allow us to balance the best use of the next new thing with still maintaining an authoritative representation from public safety. So I would just ask that you look at that part as well, perpetual change and where that overlaps with authoritative.
No, we'll certainly be taking a look at that. It's one of those things that just continues to be evolving, and the target kind of keeps moving. And so our approach is going to be to try to do some recommendations that are global enough that will apply for a significant amount of time in terms of whatever platforms. But as the evolution of new platforms, again, that changes when we look at particularly short messaging. Twitter has a certain character limit. So does we. That continues to change. Those capabilities, each within those platforms, continue to change. So I think more and more we're going to rely on the sociology that tells us how to best utilize those platforms and also make those very feasible for alert originators to use. And the exponential rate at which technology is growing is going to be a challenging process, but I think one that's worthwhile.
Yeah. So don't discount that one of your recommendations might be a policy recommendation, that if there would be better policy that would recognize that on-ramping of the next new thing in a way that can be considered authoritative sooner than it has in the past, where something has to be around for 10 years before we'll consider it public safety grade, that we find perhaps by policy that we've improved policy such that we can have public safety say, yeah, that you get the report over Facebook, it's authoritative.
Right, and we'll certainly take a look at that. One of the things that's important, I think, to understand is our unwillingness for the world around us to change isn't sufficient enough to keep it from changing. So we'll look at that.
Yeah, and one comment for Farouk. I love the way that you structured your approach. We have found the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework very important to how we recognize and assess risk in this space. The providers, communication providers, have endorsed that as well in the Working Group 4 result. And so it would be, I think while you didn't mention the risk management framework, I'm guessing that it wasn't that you're not using it, that you got down to a lower level of granularity.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
That's correct.
I'm all right with Jeff now. So.
Yes, Robert.
Thank you. I'm just curious. I don't know if it is this working group or another, but I mean, I'm with the cable industry, and I think it's great that all of the new EAS systems seem to be working toward mobile and wireless because everybody's carrying these things around with them. But I'm just curious to what extent this working group or others will look at whether it's ongoing development or continuing use of the more legacy-based systems like the emergency alert systems for cable systems, and particularly to follow up on regular testing to ensure that those systems are in place and can be used when they're needed. Don't know if it's your group or someone else's. So
it's part of our tasking to look at various platforms, and EAS is one of those. We'll certainly reach out to the folks that are working on EAS, although this one almost seems exclusively on security. But EAS is one of those platforms, and while it may be a legacy system, we do know from social science that while we have social media and all of these things, when something major really happens, people come home to television.
Right.
And so whether it's a natural event or the one that happened yesterday, those people go home to television during big events. They still utilize social media and all of these things, but how do we understand what those platforms specifically do? Are they better at one particular thing than the other, and how do they integrate into the larger ecosystem? So that's something that we'll be touching on as one of those platforms.
Okay. And obviously I have the vested interest there is no there's no liability to me as a consumer if I don't keep my app up to date or if my phone doesn't work properly, but there is a liability to me as a cable operator or as a radio station operator or television operator if that EAS system is triggered and I don't make it work properly. So we need to be part of this process so we know what our responsibilities are, and we also need to have a testing process in place so we know the systems are set up and working properly.
Understood.
Yeah, Robert, and let me make sure and foot stomp or clarify that we're interested in the larger community of platforms for that. And I would not represent cable in this area as legacy, nor broadcast. If you look at ATSC 3.0, it's very exciting as to what that could bring into this space. If you look at the similar advanced protocols that are going on in cable today and just look at consumers' experience with cable TV and more than just TV, right? Cable engagement in the home, thinking about how that plays into this new world of alerting is of just as much interest to us. And the Commission is working largely to make alerting more and more relevant to communities. And I think cable and broadcast certainly have a very important role to play in that as we go forward. So I think while most of the examples were wireless oriented, that you didn't mean to exclude the others. Right.
Thank you.
Okay, looking around the room and going to go to the phone. Any council members specifically on the phone have questions for Working Group 2, Emergency Alerting Platforms? Okay, thank you, Francisco and Farouk. Thank you. If the council will allow me, in the spirit of continuing our metaphor around football, I'm going to need to call an audible here and skip to Working Group 4B. Jennifer Manor, who is not only on the council but chairs Working Group 4B Network Timing, has a departure time that she's required to make, so we wanted to squeeze her in and make sure we got her presentation. So, Jennifer?
And thank you so much. Just waiting for the presentation.
Yeah, there we go.
So thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and report on our progress. I have to say, we've been a very busy working group. And what we're focused on is looking at alternatives or a backup solution to GNSS, or what's more commonly known as GPS. As you know, GNSS is critical for network timing and other functions, and we're highly dependent on the GNSS systems that are out there today, so we want to make sure that we have options available should there be an interruption or failure. So our working group has several deliverables, and as I go through the report, you'll see that we're making significant progress on working through them. The first, the most simple, which really turned out not to be so simple, is defining the problem, and then defining the technical characteristics for possible solutions or options that we could look at. And after that, we're going to take a look at identifying the technology's pros and cons. And finally, we plan to come back to all of you and make some recommendations on this area. So just skipping through. In terms of our status, we've already, as we've discussed, defined our deliverables, and we actually have a draft report underway, I'm very happy to say. We've completed our first deliverable of defining the problem and how that may impact the different telecommunications networks. And what was so interesting there was the different types of impacts that different type of networks may face, and that was something we spent a fair amount of time discussing. We're currently nearing the end of what I'd say is defining the requirements for the solutions that we're actually evaluating, because of course we can't come up to any options till we know what our requirements are. And as you'll see in one of the future slides, we have a number of experts coming to talk to us, which should help inform our decisions. After this period, and you'll see in the schedule in June, we'll come back to all of you and start to outline some of those options. So we won't be prepared until December of 2016 to come back with recommendations. So this just puts in place the schedule. As I said, June 2016, we'll come to the meeting with options for acquiring and implementing backup precision timing solutions that are independent of GPS. And then in December 2016, we plan to have our report on recommendations for you. So what are we doing now? We've been very successful on having bi-weekly calls, so we're going to stick with that and some offline technical discussions. We have 2 presentations scheduled this month, and I believe we just finalized one for January as well. The first is a NASA presentation on the impact of space weather and GPS, and that'll be next week. And then in a couple weeks after that, a presentation on Ethernet networks and time division management networks. So as I said, we're really in the process of completing our research on the requirements, and then we'll be able to come back to you with the options for the June meeting. So with that, that's our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm looking around the room for questions here. I imagine inventorying all of the potential use cases of life without GPS was pretty interesting, and lots of discoveries there, I imagine. We have a question.
Will be some great conversations in there. A lot of our devices don't use GPS at all. They're relying on the NTP network, which presumably often gets sourced by GPS. But are you looking at resilience of the NTP protocol and the systems therein as part of the working group?
We're going to. We haven't started that work yet, but that's included.
If I could add on top of that our interest, and I'm sorry if we didn't catch this earlier, is not just in backup to GPS. It could be that the right answer is GPS becomes backup to something else. It's really in timing resilience, as you've correctly identified, and we don't mean to over-constrain the problem into just backup for GPS. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, I'm going to go to the phone specifically for council members that may have a question for Jennifer on network timing and working group 4B. Thank you, Jennifer. Looks like you're out of here on time. And I'll bring us back to working group 3, emergency alerting system. And Steve and Kelly will be our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Williams with the NAB, and my colleague Steve Johnson is on the phone. And we are working group 3. Let's see. There we go. So we have, I'm sorry, I got eyeglass problems here, new eyeglasses. They don't work good. So we have 3 objectives. One is to look at EAS security. While the short title is sort of improving EAS security, that's actually not the detail of what we're doing, and I'll get into that a little bit. Our second topic is looking at multilingual alerting and providing EAS alerts in languages other than English. And the third topic is developing a new EAS handbook, which is the book that EAS participants use when there's alert. It's a procedures handbook. They pull it out and find the procedures to follow during a specific alert. We've got... Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Not too far. So these are deliverable dates. We have to provide recommendations on 3 of these topics. We just, with respect to the first topic, our original deliverable date was originally this meeting, and we were not able to meet that for actually a number of reasons. We've talked with Greg Cook, who is our liaison, and we've come up with providing the deliverable at the next meeting, which is the March meeting. And I guess I understand that I owe an email to Suzanne and to Jeff to officially make that so. But we've decided that this is a date we feel that we can make. The other 2 dates are for a multilingual is actually that is I believe we said that was March now, was March of 2016 as well for the multilingual, and then the handbook we're targeting for June, but that may also be flexible depending upon the staff's needs going forward and what they want to do. I think particularly, Robert, you mentioned about a test going forward. If there is another test, depending on the timing of a national test, we might want to have that handbook done for that national test. We currently have 38 members. We've just grown by leaps and bounds. We've got a great diverse group of people on our working group. I believe we have all of the equipment vendors for EAS equipment on our group. We've got all of the participant communities represented: satellite radio, satellite video, MVPDs, broadcasters are all on there. And we've got some of our government partners as well, NOAA, DHS, and FEMA participate. So we've got a good group. Pretty much everybody, for those of you who read very fast, very small type, you can go in there and find your company's names on there as well. We have broken ourselves up into 3 groups, and just to go a little bit into what these groups are doing. Our security group is to look at 3 things right now, and that is to assess the industry's awareness of EAS security best practices. So in the previous chartered CSRIC, there was a set of practices that were developed that were based on the NIST framework and applied to EAS, and we're to look at how the EAS participant community has, if they're aware of that, are they using them, how they're using that. The other thing is to make recommendations to the Commission on how it can increase awareness and increase adoption of these best practices. In the multilingual arena, we're going to take on a similar task, which is first to understand what's going on amongst the participant community and in communities nationally about multilingual alerting, what's working, what's not working, and maybe to come up with a set of recommendations for multilingual alerting. EAS handbook hasn't been updated since, is Greg in the room? I don't know, but I think sometime in the mid-20th century was the last time it was touched. Notwithstanding the national test, there was a special handbook that was done for the national test that we'll also be looking at. So I think we need a little clarification, I think, on our deliverable for that, and we'll be working with Greg to clarify. And I think the questions there really center around, are you looking for a draft of a new one? Are you looking for a markup of the old one? Those sort of things. But we'll work through those issues in course of what we're doing. So in the three groups that we have, we've created these groups. Gary Smith, who is a member of the council, he chairs our security group. Jim Dubois, who is the head of the Minnesota Association of Broadcasters. And many of you may or may not know that Minnesota has done some great efforts in multilingual alerting, and we'll certainly be looking at what they're doing and how we can apply that nationally. Gary Tim, who is the chair of the Wisconsin EAS coordinating committee, he is chairing our effort to come up with a new handbook. So we're working on these deliverables. With respect to our larger group, our main group has meetings on a 3-week cadence. The security group, for now, because it's the first deliverable coming up, we're working on a 1-week cadence. Now that's going to get disrupted with the holidays coming on. Gary has had his first meeting. We had Greg Cook, who was our liaison, on with us, and we really worked through, I think, what our deliverables are going to be, what he's looking for, try to time that with some regulatory activity that's coming up between now and through the first quarter of next year. Same thing in the multilingual. We haven't had a call yet. We hopefully will have a call. And it's kind of difficult to schedule times with people on multiple coasts, but we're working on that. Handbook, we have a little bit more lead time, but they've been having a very robust discussion already on the reflector. And that's actually a pretty good discussion on the reflector. So that's good. So I think I covered these dates, and we're having conference calls. So we'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to continue working on things and continue having our working group calls and look at, I guess we were talking earlier, and we need to understand what the actual delivery date for the March meeting will be to get some documents. So we look for guidance from the staff on that. And with that, we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Looking around the room for some questions. And, of course, all the council members know that if you have any questions to help with clarification or anything you thought was vague on any of the working groups, it's part of our role today. Anybody on the phone?
Excellent. Oh, Steve, I didn't ask if there was anything you want to add?
No, Kelly, I have nothing to add. Thank you for taking over in my absence here.
Council members on the phone, any specific questions from council members? I know Admiral Simpson has something.
Hey, Kelly, it's a very important topic, and I just want to remind the group that we're asking this question a second time. This was security for EAS was a part of the work stream for CSRIC 4. We don't have a warm fuzzy that this is being gotten after by the EAS participants. And if we continue in the future to see indications that that security isn't a priority there, and we're not seeing deliverables that either give us a better warm and fuzzy that risk is being reduced in this area, and or products that are introduced into the mix that the products are taking care of the risk. We've got to see something in the way of risk reduction. So to keep extending the due dates for these things is problematic, and it limits our options in what we can, how we approach our risk oversight responsibilities in this area. So I would just implore the group to work with the industry participants and help us reduce risk and gain the mechanisms so that if risk is being reduced and we're just not seeing it, that we have better insight into that risk reduction being achieved.
Understood.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kelly and Steve on the phone. We're going to move now to Working Group 4A, which is our submarine cable resiliency. And I believe Kent is our presenter today.
I'm going to be joined by my co-chair here, Catherine Crease, as well. So I will be brief because this is largely content that we covered in our last update for the Council. But Working Group 4A is working on two reports and building on a very laborious, but we believe important report produced by CSRIC 4, or adopted by CSRIC 4, I should note, regarding physical risks to submarine cable infrastructure and recommended separation distances from other marine activities. Working Group 4A and CSRIC 5 is focused on issues with the lack of coordination across federal, state, and local agencies, all of which play a role not only in licensing submarine cable infrastructure, but a host of other marine activities which can cause risks of damage to submarine cables and harm U.S. network resilience. And so the two reports that we're focused on here, the first is on what we're calling regulatory coordination, examining gaps in existing agency activities at the federal, state, and local levels, mechanisms that are used to coordinate in this or other areas that might be applied here, and we are certainly going to be addressing the current pending NPRM, which on behalf of NASCA, we're actually going to be filing comments later this afternoon on the Commission's proposal to create a clearinghouse for information about installed and planned submarine cables. The industry strongly supports this. It's something that industry's been looking for a government agency to take up for a long time in creating a single point of contact and gathering a lot of information that is out there and centralizing it and making it accessible to other government agencies, not telling them what to do, but creating a resource that will work to improve submarine cable protection. So one of our jobs here is to finish this report in a timely fashion so that it can be used as an input in that rulemaking, because we very much want to see that proposal adopted. The second report is on geographic diversity. And again, each of these reports is building on each other. As we've noted before, there are continuing problems with submarine cables focusing on or being installed on the same routes, because some routes are much more attractive on the seafloor than others, and clustering at particular landing sites. Sometimes government activity influences where those routes and landings occur, either because of other marine activities that are authorized that make it unappealing to route cables in particular areas, or because of long permit timelines for a landing on shore. That's why we see cables going to Oregon rather than California, for example. That is very much focused on permitting risk, not because Oregon has historically been a big hub for POPs and population, but certainly it's becoming an attractive landing point. So our membership continues to grow. We are still chasing an Army Corps of Engineers participant as they play a key role in issuing permits for all installed submarine cable systems in U.S. waters. We very much want their input as we have other agencies that are actively involved, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. These agencies have actually made presentations to our working group in describing their own permitting activities for the industries, whether it's commercial fishing or offshore wind or oil and gas that they regulate. And it's established a very good dialogue that we hope will continue after even these reports are complete. So otherwise, we continue. Our members are scattered all over the country, and we have a couple people calling in from the UK and New Zealand, so we meet by phone, and we are continuing to work toward delivering our first report at the March meeting. So otherwise, as was noted earlier, occasionally we see news reports focusing on submarine cable activity, which generally doesn't get a lot of news attention. Sometimes it's a little sensational, perhaps not for the right reasons. Stories about shark bite that came out earlier this year, almost entirely erroneous. And of course, a lot of attention about stories about Russian vessels operating near installed submarine cable systems. And I think the important thing to keep in mind there is that the statistical risks to submarine cables that are the most significant are very mundane. The Russia story reads like something out of a John le Carré novel, but statistically the big risks are commercial fishing and anchoring and uncoordinated energy development. And those are all things that the federal government can do something about, and certainly with a better clearinghouse function housed at the FCC, that the FCC really could help to facilitate. So with that, I don't think I need to talk anything more about process. Catherine, have I missed anything?
No, you've covered it all. Thank you.
Great. Any questions?
Catherine and Kent, thank you. We'll look around the room for questions in the room. 10 cards. Any council members on the phone that would like to ask a question of Kent or Catherine on submarine cable resiliency, Working Group 4A? Thank you, Kent and Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we already covered Working Group 4B. We're going to go to Working Group 5, which is our Cybersecurity Information Sharing Working Group. And Rod, Chris, and Brian are the tri-chairs of that. And okay, here comes Chris.
Hi there. Excellent. Okay. So my name's Chris Boyer, and I'm with AT&T, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Working Group 5, along with Rod Rasmussen, who's on the phone, and Brian Allen from Time Warner Cable. And for this particular working group, we're focusing on cybersecurity information sharing. So the slide deck that I sent around provides the basic description of the working group, in which we're focused on reviewing the current state of information sharing in the communications industry, and then documenting kind of a baseline of what that looks like now, and then looking at recommendations about how to improve strategic information sharing in the future. So that's generally the mission that we've been following. The membership is very broad, as you can see. We have representatives from each of the 5 subsectors of the communications industry. So it includes wireline, wireless, satellite, broadcast, and cable. And we have representatives from each one of those sectors, and also from several of our business partners that provide cybersecurity information services and other assets to the industry, and representatives from governments. We have a very broad working group which is looking into this particular subject. In terms of the organization, the steps in this was looking at different use cases was the first one, and then looking at basically, I don't have a copy of the slides in front of me, so I'm trying to see it off the screen, which is a bit far away. Maybe I need glasses. Thank you. Just trying to trigger my memory here. Oh, thanks. I had them on my computer, right? So this is what happens when you try to do everything electronically. I got it. So we started out with the organization of it was focusing on 4 different studies to represent our 4 different efforts to do the recommendations, starting with the use cases. So we're working on those, and I'll get to the timeline here in a second about when they'll be due. Also looking at different barriers to information sharing. So things like if there were ways to improve information sharing in the industry, what are the obstacles to that happening? The third one is optimal sharing trust pools. So these are different partners, our business relationships in relation to information sharing. And the last one is conduits for information sharing. So that's basically the 4 main study efforts that we're looking at. And the next slide goes to the deliverables. So the first deliverable that we've been focusing on that we actually are in the process of completing, I would say it's complete for the purposes of the meeting today. The first one is an information sharing diagram. So this is a flow diagram. We put this together with several members of the working group. It's something we've been working on for probably the last 6 months. For those of us who have a network background, I think better when I look at pictures and diagrams. So that we were trying to put together something that showed kind of the flow of how we share information today, and then from there we're going to build the use cases. So the goal was to finish the diagram by this meeting, and then in March we're planning to have the final drafts of the use cases. Our tentative objective is to have the draft use cases done by January 31st, and then the final versions by the next CSRIC meeting in March. And then along the way, as we develop the use cases, we will be discussing some of the impediments or barriers to information sharing. So we'll be building that out, and hopefully we'll have that information by the June timeframe. And then we will commence into looking at the trust pools and platforms from there. So that will be the September and December 2016 deliverables with the final report in March of 2017. Any questions on the timeline? Okay. Nope, back one. All right, so in terms of status, we have agreed to recurring calls on Fridays. We held a face-to-face meeting on November 4th where we reviewed the working group description. We sent final edits to that over to the FCC liaisons. They finalized the description. We updated the deliverables and the timeline and milestones, and we went through the diagram, which I'll walk you through in the next slide. And I think the other thing that we're working on right now is while we do the diagram, while we work on the use cases, it will be identifying examples of the types of information that are being shared. So I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through this picture. So this is the diagram that we've been working on. It's a little detailed, so I'll give you kind of a quick run through this. But if you go to the very left-hand side, the goal here was really to segment this into 2 different. It's kind of hard to follow, but to segment it into 2 different areas. That is sharing within the industry with business partners and sharing with government. So if you go to the left-hand side where it says trusted peers and commercial partners, this is an example of sharing with entities like the Network Service Providers Group, which is a group of ISPs that meets weekly to talk about security threats, formal and informal peer organizations. So that could be an entity like Ops Trust, which is a cybersecurity information sharing venue that a lot of our operations people routinely interface with, or working with commercial third-party services or partners. I know Rod's on the phone, and I know that Shadow Server, I know Richard's on as well. So these are other parties that we would partner with on sharing information. So those are kind of different trusted peers and commercial partners that we deal with on security. And then on the bottom half of this left-hand side of the diagram where it says ISP internal use, this talks about, if you follow the flow, of how some of the information we collect from these different sources, how we use them to protect our internal IT enterprise systems, our service delivery networks, and also provide information to our customers as part of managed security services. So what we're trying to do here is get a full picture of how does the industry input information, what are the venues in which we're talking to each other, and then conversely, how do we take information in, and what are the sources of that information, and how do we use that to protect ourselves and to protect our customers? That's really what we're trying to drive towards. So that's kind of the customer side of this. And then on the government side, you have some of these other boxes like law enforcement, sector policy and planning, public-private partnerships, and the DHS process. This is where you're sharing information with the government, like the NCIC, the National Communications Cybersecurity Integration Center that DHS runs. So things like, what information would go to government agencies, or in the incident of in the event of like a security breach, what information is shared with law enforcement. So what we're trying to do is take this picture and develop use cases around each of these. And what we decided to do in the working group is divide basically into two subgroups. One will be focused on kind of the private-to-private sharing aspect. Another one will be focused on the private-to-government and government-to-private aspect of it. And for the private-to-private piece, we'll be building out use cases on the trusted peers and commercial partners. So this is taking the diagram and putting words around it and explaining what are we really talking about. And then also the same thing for the ISP internal use. How are ISPs using that? How do we put that into managed security services that we sell to our customers and that kind of thing. So that'll be the kind of private-to-private piece. And then the private-to-government piece will be focusing on kind of the DHS process and how do we share information with the NCIC and what are some examples of that, as well as with law enforcement, and how do we do kind of sector policy and planning functions through the ComSector Coordinating Council. So that's kind of the government half. So those two subgroups, I'm hoping to get them kicked off in the next couple of weeks. We have our next call tomorrow, so hopefully we'll be able to make some progress there and get them moving forward. And we'll be asking those groups to develop the use cases, like I said, to have the first cut of those by the end of January with the final draft sometime in March. And by then we should have a good written baseline of how the industry is sharing today and a decent handle on some of the obstacles that we might face in some of these environments. And I will point out that the reason these lines are, and I know this is a little bit confusing to see for the first time, but the reason some of these lines are different colors is to talk about the types of information, because we all know that there are very significant privacy issues that come into play, and there's legal issues that come into play with sharing with different entities on here, in particular when you're talking the government side. So depending upon the type of information, there are different obstacles that you have to deal with. So for example, if I'm sharing information about an attack on myself, I can share that with, like, AT&T could talk to Verizon, I could talk to Comcast, I could talk to others. So that's what to the extent that you wanted to do that, there's a lot of business issues that come into play there, so don't get me wrong. But assuming you wanted to have that conversation, you could do that within venues like the Network Service Providers Group. But if you're talking about customer information, there are quite a few different laws that come into play that restrict the sharing of that type of information. So it becomes very relevant as to what exactly you're talking about. And if my lawyers were here, they would say that depending upon the circumstances, the rules are going to be different. So it's a very complex issue. But that's why we're trying to tackle it by looking at these different types of sharing, private to private versus private to government. The next slide goes through the timeline. So as I mentioned, we completed the diagram. There's probably going to be a couple of minor tweaks to this diagram, because I think Rod had pointed out there's a few things on here that we need to update, but there will be minor changes. And then the next step is to do the use cases. And we need to finalize the membership. We've had quite a few the list I showed you was the current list. We've had quite a few new members that have come in and out of the working group, so I want to make sure, in particular, making sure that they've been fully vetted and are approved, and then focusing on the baseline use cases by January and March. So that's kind of where we are. Any questions about the diagram or kind of the structure of the working group? Robert.
Chris, very, very impressive work here in terms of capturing the ecosystem of information sharing. Can you comment on the alignment, relationship between this initiative and the current effort that is being organized under DHS with respect to the development of the ISOs of the next coming years? Do these efforts link up at some point?
I think they do, because so for those who aren't following it, the ISOs are the Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations. They were created by an executive order that was put out last February, and DHS is working on a process to basically establish kind of the running rules around what would constitute an ISO. The concept being that each sector of critical infrastructure, there's 16 sectors: communications, IT, financial services, power, water, gas, et cetera. Each one of those sectors has their own Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or an ISAC. But what the White House wanted to do is expand that, and I'm paraphrasing, but they wanted to expand that so that entities that were not just sectors could actually have their own information sharing entity. So this would be like a regional entity or issue-specific entity or something like that. So they're trying to put these ISOs out there and they're working on standards around what is an ISOW, so that there has to be at least something. They can't just declare, like self-declare I'm an ISOW. They have to actually fulfill some sort of standards, and then they could potentially enter into an agreement with DHS where they could share information to and from an entity like the NCIC. So that's kind of that process is playing out. I think Robert's question is a good question, because that just becomes yet an additional source of information that potentially could feed into what the communications companies are doing. I think that, so they would probably fall on that diagram on the it could either be the commercial side or on the business side, depending upon where the information flow is, whether it's coming directly to us or it's being facilitated through DHS. I will say that one of the challenges I see in this issue is that DHS is saying that they're going to turn up literally in the thousands of ISOWs, and there's a big concern, I think, about the just information overload, because a lot of our companies are already inundated with cyber information, and the resources are already pretty constrained. So taking in a whole bunch of new data from these new parties is going to be a challenge. So I think I've said this many times, half kiddingly, but that there's actually a big business opportunity for somebody to go in there and make sense out of all that information. So.
Yeah, and Robert, it is a very good question, and I'd add that I think one of the great things that Chris has done with his group is to help identify that information sharing rolls easily off the tongue, but really what information to be shared has a number of different flavors, and threat information sharing is very different from information sharing during an attack when you're trying to affect machine speed mitigations. And the trust associated with who you'll share threat information with may be very different from the trust that you would share the, hey, it worked in my network, it might work in your network too, at a machine-to-machine speed. So I think it's fantastic that you've focused on the different elements of information flows so that you can then tie that to trust pools for those various flows. And while the ISAOs certainly will have a role in that constellation as we go forward, they won't wholly define the universe of the information sharing that a company might want to do with another company, for example. So that standards development for the ISAOs is ongoing. I think DHS has the University of Texas developing that under contract. The regulators are working to help ensure that there's an input to that standards group from the various regulators. And I would certainly encourage this group, if there's an interim product that would be useful to that ISAO standards development, to drive to a timeline that would allow you to take an interim piece of what you're working on to influence that standards development.
Yeah, I would say that's a very good question. Thank you, Admiral. I think as far as the diagram goes, we actually started working on the diagram, I think, as you know, a while back. And so it's been an iterative process over the last 6 to 8 months, even before the working group got kicked off. And it's partially the product of the Sector Coordinating Council as well. And so the Sector Coordinating Council has been engaging with the ISAO DHS process throughout. So the comms ISAC representatives and some of our folks from the CSCC are already engaging. So I do think we plan to do that as much as we can. And we have a vested interest in the standards there as well. The biggest issue is making sure that partially that the process is consistent with the stuff that a lot of the other established players are doing. And I think to some degree it's going to be a little bit of a amorphous thing, right? Because we're going to see these groups kind of pop up and they're going to work on the standards piece, and we'll have to sort out, what are the players that have useful and relevant information for communications networks and who doesn't, and how do you piece all that information together. It'll be a challenge, but I think it's a good challenge, right, in a way. So.
Chris, I have a question. Obviously, a very good diagram that you put there in place, and certainly the arrows signify this, but just in the way of clarity, is the working group also thinking about specific information and threats that may be, very helpful from various government agencies, that industry could use? So it shows the arrows both directions, but I just wanted to make sure that's an important part. And this is the second working group that used to have a famine and now has a feast of data. So it seems as though there's a lot to do around data, but I wanted to just ask about that reverse as well.
Yeah, it's not you highlighted a good point. It's not a mistake that the arrows are bidirectional. That was intentional because we do feel like in both with the government and also with our partners, like a lot of the times when we work with third parties on security, there's a give and take of information exchange between the companies and their business partners. A lot of our customers, but also with some of our vendors out there that we work with. And so on both ends of that, it's a two-way flow of information most of the time. So that's an intentional thing, and we'll have to figure out how to describe that in the report. These are somewhat complicated issues, but that is definitely the case.
That's great. Robert, did you still have a question, or just want to make sure with your tent card there before I go to the phone?
Sorry.
That's okay. I didn't want to skip you, sir. Anyone on the phone who's a specific council member who would like to have a question of Chris on cyber security information sharing? Okay, that's great. Thank you, Chris. So we're going to move to Working Group 6, which is Security by Design. And we have Joel and Brian, who are co-chairs of this working group.
Good afternoon. I'm Joel Molyneux from CBS, and this is my co-chair, Brian. So we're going to talk to you about Working Group 6, which is Secure Hardware and Software Security by Design. And
Chris is coming back.
All right. Now, you can keep presenting if you want, Chris. If you want to keep going.
You want me to keep presenting?
Yeah, keep presenting. It's okay.
There's information sharing, and then there's sharing of the clicker.
That's right. So a lot of this presentation is consistent with what we presented at the last meeting because not much has changed since then, but I'll go through some of the background slides. Anyway, our objectives have not changed. We have two objectives: to develop best practices to enhance the security of hardware and software in the core communications network at the design stage. And then the second is to develop a voluntary mechanism to demonstrate how those best practices are being followed. In terms of deliverables, we have a deliverable in March of 2016, and that is the best practices recommendations. And then in September, the voluntary attestation framework, which is how those are being followed, those best practices. We have a large group, approximately 40 participants from the vendors, the service providers, some government agencies, and we've had some active participation over the last few months, which has been terrific. In terms of background, we're leveraging the work done by the previous CSRIC and the TAC in terms of looking at ways to incorporate security into the design process, and we are leveraging some of the work done by the NIST cybersecurity framework and some other frameworks, and we'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. In our status, we are continuing to grow the working group a little bit with more subject matter expertise, but we're using the three-phase approach that we talked about last time, where we are first evaluating the scope and then doing the analysis and then working on the deliverables for both of these projects. And we've been holding recurring Working Group 6 calls on a biweekly basis and having other calls and in-person meetings as well. So we held our first in-person meeting on November 17th, and this is where we really came to agreement on several things. So we agreed to use the NSRA core network definition, and this was a big part of our discussion over the last few months, is how are we defining core and how are we defining the scope for this project, because it could really spiral out of control. So we came to some agreement, we came to agreement on that, and that was a big first step for us. And then we also agreed to incorporate the perspectives from the vendor side as well as the service provider side into those best practices. In addition, we agreed that the deliverable should be basically technology and device agnostic, where if we start looking at the specific devices within the core network, that we're going to get to too much of a granular level in analyzing what these best practices should be, and we thought that that would be counter to our ability to have these be scalable and measurable over time. We also agreed that the best practices should draw from existing standards like the NIST cybersecurity framework and others, and we're moving towards that. And we created a new subgroup which will work on those best practices, and they will be providing their initial take on that by December 14th. And on the next slide is just a view of our schedule and our timeline with the different phases for both of the projects, and we're on track for the March 2016 deliverable. And for next steps our primary next step is to finalize those best practices for review on December 14th and continue our biweekly calls and updates for the overall group in preparation for March 2016, the deliverable.
That's great. Thank you. Any questions for Joel or Brian on our Security by Design working group in the room? Yes. Trey.
Trey Fogarty with the National Emergency Number Association. Obviously, for us in the public safety sector, security of hardware and software is sort of critical given the sensitivity of the kinds of information we deal with. I'm curious, in the composition of the work group, and I just wasn't able to see it on the slide, have you had success in getting participation from the folks at the really sort of low-level aspects of this, so folks from Tylera, TSMC, the folks who actually design and build the chips that ultimately go into these sorts of things, are the folks that design those participating actively, or is that something where you need some additional input, or do you think it's well covered?
Thanks. I think we'd welcome participation from those entities. To add the angle, the public safety angle is crucial. So we do have some engagement from the public safety community now, but you can never have enough, I think. So we should talk to you offline in a moment about that.
Yeah, but I think Trey was saying not just the public safety community, but specifically the supply chain associated with that, and getting lower in the supply chain so that we're looking at components that make up products, which wouldn't be exactly the public safety community.
Right. Yeah, sure. I think we've got a pretty diverse mix of that's represented so far, but from both hardware and software side and components. We really tried very, very much to incorporate all those people when we were recruiting people from the get-go. But that's something that can always be improved. So I'd love to incorporate anyone further that we need to.
I just offer a recommendation in tying to what Joel said earlier, that in necking down the task, so you weren't trying to boil the ocean. That's a Navy reference. Hard to do. Don't try. That it would be helpful that you also kind of described the demarcations in a supply chain manner of where you not just the network core element, but how deep did you go in the development? I mean, you could go all the way down to the development of a chip, or do you really want to stop at the board level, or do you want to stop at the product level? I think I'm less interested in specifically a particular outcome to say how deep would be useful, but it would be very useful to know how deep you did go, vis-a-vis the supply chain, so that if it looks like follow-on work would be useful, we know where you ended.
That's great. We have another question. Andy
Ellis with Akamai. Many of the challenges that people have with Secure by Design is there sort of a checklist of things that you're going to try to synthesize down to best practices, and there's a growing body of belief that for system safety, complex system analysis is probably more what's needed. Something like the airline industry's system theoretic process analysis, the STPA program. So are we looking at hazard analysis models in addition to recommendations of best practices, or are we falling on one side of that camp or the other?
We have not looked at hazard analysis models, no.
Okay.
So we've been looking at some of the industry standards, not just NIST, but others that are out there, and trying to synthesize that into some recommendations.
Okay, I think that means I just volunteered to provide some introductions there.
That'd be great. Yeah. Yep, thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Questions from council members on the phone? Okay, thank you, Joel and Brian. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're going to move to Working Group 7, which is our cybersecurity workforce, and I think Bill will be our presenter.
Joined by my co-chair, Drew
Bill
Moore,
and Mike.
however. Okay, let's see if we get that up.
While Bill's working on bringing up the slides, and before we lose people, at the lunch that we had with the working group chairs, a electronic key to some D.C. office was found. And it's not ours.
It's good we're on security.
That's right. Yeah, if anyone dropped it, please see Suzanne. And if not, we're going to try office by office in the next.
It's part of our security assessment.
We won't put it in any FCC machine.
Very secure. All right. Given that as introduction, Workgroup 7, Cybersecurity Workforce Development. Go to the next slide. The objectives, again, understand what's going to take to help increase the totality of the cybersecurity workforce available to the U.S., particularly in the telecoms industry. So developing the recommendations that the FCC should take to help encourage the development of that workforce, make sure that's properly skilled and available to support our missions. Now, again, this hasn't changed since the last discussion as well. We're using the NICE Cybersecurity Workforce Framework, the CWF, and going to compare that against the telecom industry needs so that we can understand any gaps, the areas that would help us close those gaps. So moving on to the work group members, I think we've stabilized that at this point. We haven't had additional folks join us yet. We have one who's not mentioned here, which is Frank Sissia.
Oh, so we did, however, recently add a member of the CWA. Now, before anyone panics in here, that's the Cyber Workforce Alliance. Just want to be sure that we understand. So we mentioned that the first time to our friends in the FCC, and there was some initial surprise, and we've resolved that surprise. So they bring to the table some unique capabilities, which we'll discuss a little later in the discussion here. Go to the next. Key issue here is all the available information and our own experience as practitioners is that there is not a sufficient quantity of skilled cybersecurity practitioners available. I can tell you from my own experience as the CISO out there in Seattle area, between small companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, the talent pool competition gets pretty intense, particularly for those highly skilled practitioners that you need for the tough problems that we've got to solve. So there's plenty of other anecdotal and research data that supports the assertion that we have to do more to increase the available supply to meet that demand. Now, Frank and I will take a look at some of the issues around what is workforce planning process actually address. There's multiple steps that now our particular workforce is going to be focused on the first phase, which is defining and identifying the workforce elements, helping to determine what's required to be capable, competent, and effective in those roles. So specifically, the subset for Workgroup 7 is identify the functional positions and roles and develop the competency, skills, and proficiency levels that are in. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, animation.
Oh, it's animated. Okay, that's why. Let's do the build out then so it's all up. Okay, there we go. So what we're doing, as I mentioned with regards to this CWA, what they brought to the table and have made available to our work group is a similar exercise that they had performed previously with the financial services industry, where as part of taking the NIST framework, the NICE framework, and working with representatives of the financial services industry to identify gaps
or areas to be included that would build out that framework and make it totally relevant to the needs of that particular industry segment. So what we're doing is following that protocol. It allows us to accelerate our ability to do the analysis necessary, and we provided our work group members with that framework documentation so they can help give us the feedback that we need to identify what gaps in knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then ultimately competencies and capabilities that are needed. So our current status, again, we've completed our vetting. We've worked with the FCC liaisons, and our working group members have been tasked with that review of the KSA framework that was provided to us, consistent with the NIST and the NICE frameworks. So our schedule includes the following. Through January, we'll complete the review of the KSAs and the competencies review. Well, in February, we'll focus then on taking it to the next level up, which would be the specialties and the categories review. And then in March, we'll be able to submit the initial version 1.0 of that framework. Now, given that this is there's almost 500 different KSAs alone.
There's like 368 KSAs when you apply. The others, it ends up being about a 1,500 entity database, so it's rather large.
It's quite an extensive table, so the expectation is the 1.0 will continue to be refined until the final deadline deliverable of 2017, but it'll start to give us a working framework that we'll be able to leverage in the ongoing work. The goal is that by September 2016, we'll have the draft workgroup best practices implementation, which is the second part of it. First is getting the data that says what does the workforce consist of. Second is what are the best practices, uses of that kind of information, whether you're a practitioner or other organizations, so that you know your workforce is properly skilled, properly equipped, and positioned to deliver the services that are required. And then in March 2017, we expect to deliver our final report to the workgroup. So next steps. We're focused on that KSA gap analysis with multiple phased implementations. We have biweekly conference calls for our participants, and we're kicking off the planning for the best practices report that we'll have to finish in the first quarter of 2016. And we'll provide our ongoing updates to the council and the committee as required. So, Drew, is there anything else you want to add?
I had two quick things. One is to reiterate that what we're going to be delivering for our first deliverable is an actual data set that will be usable free of charge. I want to say just open source available from the FCC to all communication sector members, and it's going to have all the data that we would have put together. And then, of course, we're going to be working to continue that data refinement as we continue on with best practices. So it is going to be, as opposed to just a report of how to do it, it's going to be done. That is our objective. It's a tall thing. We're trying not to boil the ocean just to bite off one leg of the elephant at a time, but that's our goal. The second and most important thing is go Navy, beat Army.
As a former Army officer, I might not share those particular aspirations. However, I think the statistical reality is it should be an interesting game. And one last thing I did want to make mention and appreciation for Erica's support in this particular exercise and the Office of General Counsel. We had to kind of stress them in a unique way because this information that we obtained from CWA had to be gifted over to the FCC, so that required additional cycles of analysis, but it was completed timely. It was just awesome. So very, very, very much appreciate that.
That's great. Questions for Bill and Drew in the room? 10 cards. Council members on the phone, any questions?
Yeah, Bill and Drew, thanks for taking this on. This is so important, and it sounds like the work product that we're going to see here in March is going to be extremely useful, not just to the FCC, but even more importantly to the industry. I would offer that we can further increase the value by thinking about beyond the industry, what do we want to influence with the product? For example, universities, community colleges, training institutes. So you have quite a task ahead of you, maybe reserving a little bit of the time of the group to think about that element of stakeholders that are beyond FCC and the industry that we would together want to use this product to try to ensure that some of that training and education challenge isn't just borne by each of the companies alone.
We're very fortunate.
We do have representation both from universities and other sources of academic and training. We're leveraging them as part of that as well, sir.
Yeah. So leveraging them to come up with a good, relevant product is one thing, but then to determine that how do we take it out to? I mean, should we seek? Should there be a cybersecurity for the communications industry academic curriculum? That would potentially add to the cyber curricula that are out there today. So the second thing I'd like to do is just thank you for the feedback on Erica. She is spearheading Monday out in Boulder, teaming with the University of Colorado, a one-day workshop for public safety communication, cybersecurity, and she'll be deep diving and hoping to stimulate additional discussion out there from the different stakeholder groups that she'll bring back into the working group as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Ruben.
Great. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Drew and Bill. So we're at our last working group for today, and as promised, and just a little bit of an intro here, this is Working Group 8, which is our priority services. And if the council will recall, last time we were together in our meeting, we did not have chairs to lead this working group. So Bill Reedway from New Star and Tom Anderson from Cisco are our co-chairs. This presentation is a little different because they recently took the role of leadership as co-chairs of this working group, and the presentation will look a little bit like what the council saw for all the other working groups last time we were together, where they had gotten the scope and description of what the working group's deliverables and results would be, but this is the working group reading back to us just that, as the former working groups did in the last council meeting with all of us. So particularly important to have the council here ask clarifying and questions to help reduce any ambiguity, because after today's meeting and this readout from Bill and Tom, this working group will begin their work based on what they're telling us here today. So I'll turn it over to Bill and Tom.
Thank you, John. As John mentioned, my name is Tom Anderson from Cisco, co-chair for this working group on priority services, and this is Bill Reedway from New Star. We'll jointly present the material we have so far, but as John mentioned, we've just started the work. We've had 2 meetings, and we're still sorting out how we're going to do what we're going to do, and so you won't see a lot of substantive change from probably what was reported last time, but we can provide some color on what we're thinking in this area. As you've probably seen before, we've got a working group description and some deliverables. The working group description reads that we will assess how priority service programs can take advantage of packet-based technologies and recommend protocols that can be used to ensure priority communications. Now, what we're thinking at this point is that we're probably take a very broad view of what we mean by protocols, that this problem is a significant problem. As you probably all realize, there are many different minds in the path of the effort, and likely it requires more of a framework and solution architecture perspective to really apply priority services across the wide variety of networks and network contexts that we see today. So I think you can expect us to be thinking about not just protocols, but frameworks and solution architectures, that is, sets of protocols and technical methods and procedures to see how we can actually address the problem from a technical perspective. I don't expect any miracles here, but hopefully we should have at least requirements and a good high-level structure and view by the time we're done as to how you start to proceed with this very difficult problem of, given that you want to apply priority to a communication path, how you might go about doing that in today's very wide and disparate set of network contexts. So from a deliverable perspective, we've got a variety of things on the plate, and you'll notice that
as with most working groups, we're going to start with use cases. And a very important part of what we do has to be founded and grounded in what people actually need to do. So we're going to start with use cases and apply those use cases really to the network context. That is, what does the network look like in this use case? And usually there'll be a set of networks because you're going to communicate with someone else that probably is not on the same local network or even core network. It'll go through a variety of networks. So you've got network-to-network protocols and interchange issues. And you'll need authentication in this case to make sure that the network understands who you are as a priority user to apply the right priorities and policies to that traffic stream. So a lot of technical details to look at. So certainly one of the first things we do, as I said, is to look at the use cases that we can use as the basis of the work. We then will take the use cases and try to create a priority services framework that can address things like authentication as well as just the basic fundamental aspects of prioritizing traffic through the network and properly exchanging priority mechanisms between networks as traffic goes between networks. We need to do that with a variety of different networks. We need to do that for both domestic and international access and termination as well. So it's a very broad set of needs and network characteristics we need to look at. We're also planning to look then at the more practical aspects of ordering billing, provisioning these service capabilities, and management of these service capabilities as we define those technically in the prior work to meet the use cases. I think it is a lot of work to do, a lot of new ground that we probably need to cut. So I expect that the work will start top down, very high level, and work our way down. I don't expect that we'll be providing any recommendations on specific solutions, but rather the kinds of things, the kinds of requirements that we'll need to meet to start to address these issues as we go forward in building the next generation networks. From a working group team perspective, you've got the list up on the monitors, and I think we've got good participation and good membership across the board. And while you take a look at this list, let me introduce Bill to complete the remainder of the presentation. Bill?
Thank you, Tom. Again, my name is Bill Reedway from New Star. Very good to meet everybody. Just wanted to follow Tom's discussion with a bit of an update in terms of what's happened so far. As we mentioned, Tom and I were announced as co-chairs about 5 weeks ago on October 29th. Since then, we've had 2 meetings of the working group. Still accepting nominations, so we've got the group is coalescing around the objectives. We spend most of our time in those discussions, as Tom mentioned, talking about how we were going to take the description and objectives and mandate at a high level down to a concrete set of use cases to define the work. And mixed in there, the Admiral and his team were good enough to give us some of their time to provide some additional context, and we've shared that with the group as well. We've got a draft provisional schedule for the group's work up here. I say that only because these dates haven't been formally ratified by the members, but we felt it was important to start to get some stakes in the ground. As I said, our first task in our biweekly meetings is to get ourselves to a concrete set of use cases that will define our scope. We've set ourselves a task by the end of the first quarter of next year. We'll have that list for external review, and we think there's probably enough content there to fit our final deliverables into 2 separate reports, and you can see the schedule for draft and final submission of those reports here on the slide. In terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we're at biweekly working group calls now with the opportunity to increase the frequency there as needed. The working group, as I said, is very close to getting finalization in terms of the membership. Our immediate tasks is to define that set of use cases which are going to create the scope of our reports and develop a project plan and assign owners to the pieces of those work products. And of course, to provide periodic updates to you fine people. And thus endeth the first presentation for Working Group 8. Any questions.
On to questions.
Yeah.
Tim.
Yes, I just wondered, it sounds like some of the problems you're going to be addressing are exactly the same kinds of situations that FirstNet's going to address.
Mm-hmm.
Is FirstNet participating at all in the work group? Or?
Yeah, we've got participants from DHS that are providing us some liaisons between those two, and we actually had talked about this a little bit. One of the first things that we need to do is rationalize our effort against the other things that are going on at OEC. The members of the working group do recognize that there's some overlap there, and that's why our first step is really to define concretely what's going to be the scope of this group and how's it going to relate to the work that's going on elsewhere. Anything?
No, that's good. That's
good.
Okay. Admiral has some questions, but before we go there, I want to go to the phone first. Anyone, council members on the phone who have questions of Working Group 8 Priority Services? Okay, Admiral Simpson.
Yeah. Let me thank Bill and Tom for an excellent start on this. Really pleased that you guys are organizing so strongly for this and have a great plan set out as you go ahead. There's a national imperative to get this one right. We're in that process of technology transition where we are still hanging on to some of our old legacy circuits for precisely this reason, that we haven't completely figured out end-to-end how we ensure a priority of communication when there's a national emergency or when there's a disaster or terrorist attack of such consequence where there's significant critical infrastructure that is no longer there, and we need to ensure that the right public safety and national security communications have the ability to go to the head of line for that remaining infrastructure. And this is a landscape now that is a patchwork quilt, as you guys have identified, of providers. So needing to hand off the token for prioritization as the packets for the communication go cross-boundary between provider to provider is a real task. I think your focus on not the technology of that, but of the relationships and the structure and the framework for achieving that across so many different technical modalities is the right one. DoD and Commerce, NTIA have contacted us. They want to provide some technical expertise to help your group as well. It's reflective of how much of the communications for our intelligence community, for our Department of Defense, for our Homeland Security, first responders, from federal, state, down to local, are reliant on commercial communications infrastructure, that they see this kind of importance to be a part of this. So thanks so much. Please let us know if there are any obstacles that we can help beat down, and look forward to your next report. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our update from the working groups today. I think we've made some very positive momentum this year in 2015, just getting CSRIC 5 kicked off, and everything just went through with updates and statuses. My sense is we continue to make real good progress against Chairman Wheeler's and Admiral Simpson's priorities here in CSRIC 5. If people missed it, I guess Working Group 3 got a little bit of a show us more kind of report card today. And I think Working Group 8, albeit big, complex, is in a place now with great leadership to catch up. So we didn't have any scheduled votes today, and I think that even lets us get out a little early. Just want to remind everyone that when we get together in March 16th will be our next council meeting. I'm expecting that there'll be at least a handful of working groups that will have some deliverables that we'll have to vote on. So that is going to probably take us to the normal close of the meeting in March of 2016. In the interim, the monthly steering committee meetings will continue, hosted by Teresa Hennessy and the FCC deputies and the working group chairs, just to ensure we're moving the deliverables forward and we're on track for the productive meeting that we hope to have in March of 2016. So I'd like to wish everyone on the council, the working group chairs, our FCC liaisons, and all the supporting members of CSRIC 5 a happy holiday season. And I'll turn it over to Admiral Simpson for his closing comments before Jeff closes the meeting officially.
Let me thank all the working groups and the working group chairs. Really excited about the work that you're doing. There's an energy and a synergy between the groups that is really impressive, and it will serve the nation well that you're bringing that kind of attention to this. Thank you also, John, for finishing early. I also would like to wish everyone a happy holiday season here. Today, though, is particularly important because it's that time of the year where the Federal Communications Bar Association puts on the chairman's dinner, at which the chairman gets roasted and the chairman roasts. And I in the couple of years now that I've now been invited into this communications DC environment, it's affectionately known as the Telcom Prom. So thanks for getting us out on time to the Telcom Prom tonight. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming out to see us today, and for the great job that you did. Please have safe travels home, safe, warm, happy holiday season, and we'll see you here in March 16th.